In the dark winter of 1941, while bombs fell over London and the Luftwaffe thundered across the night sky, a young German refugee named Klaus Fuchs quietly began a different kind of battle. Not with weapons, but with equations. A brilliant theoretical physicist, Fuchs had fled Nazi Germany only a few years earlier. He carried no rifle, wore no uniform, yet his contribution would one day shape the course of modern warfare. Born in Rüsselsheim, Germany in 1911, Fuchs grew up under the shadow of the First World War and the political turmoil that followed. His father, a staunch pacifist and Lutheran minister, raised his children to question authority and seek truth. But as Hitler's power rose in the 1930s, those ideals became dangerous. Fuchs, then a member of the Communist Party, was forced to flee the Gestapo's reach. By 1933, he had crossed into Britain, a refugee seeking safety, unaware he was stepping onto the stage of one of history's most consequential moral paradoxes. In Britain, Fuchs found refuge in academia. At the University of Bristol and later Edinburgh, he studied under some of the leading minds of European physics. His calm intelligence and precise mathematical reasoning quickly caught the attention of colleagues. When war broke out in 1939, the British scientific establishment found itself in crisis. Hitler's Germany had expelled or silenced many of Europe's top physicists: Einstein, Born, Meitner, while Britain scrambled to harness their knowledge before the Nazis could weaponize it. In 1940, Britain launched a covert initiative known as Tube Alloys, the nation's first organized effort to explore atomic energy for military use. The goal: to determine whether a nuclear chain reaction could unleash unprecedented destructive force, a superbomb. Few outside the highest echelons of the government even knew it existed. Among those selected to join the program was Klaus Fuchs, then a rising star at Birmingham University under physicist Rudolf Peierls. Fuchs' mathematical precision proved invaluable in modeling the behavior of uranium and plutonium under extreme conditions. His work on the diffusion of neutrons became essential in understanding how an atomic explosion might be triggered. Peierls described him as quiet, meticulous, and entirely trustworthy. None could have imagined that this same man would one day pass their greatest secret to another power. At the time, Fuchs's loyalty seemed beyond question. As a German refugee, he was officially classified as an enemy alien, yet the British government made exceptions for trusted scientists. When he took the oath of allegiance to the Crown, it marked not only his formal acceptance into British scientific circles, but also his entry into the shadow world of wartime intelligence. MI5 maintained a file on him, but nothing, not a whisper or a rumor, suggested he was anything other than a committed anti-fascist. And perhaps he was. Fuchs despised Hitler, but he also distrusted the capitalist West. In his mind, the war was more than a fight against Nazism. It was a struggle over the very future of humanity. He believed that socialism, not empire, offered the only path to equality. That conviction would become the quiet storm inside him, the reason he would eventually cross the line from scientist to spy. By 1941, Britain's isolation deepened. The United States remained neutral, and Soviet Russia, though fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, was not yet part of the Western Alliance. Fuchs watched from the laboratory as entire cities were flattened by German air raids. Each night, the distant rumble of bombs echoed across Birmingham. He began to wonder, could science end this madness? Or would it only create new forms of it? Unbeknownst to his colleagues, Fuchs had already caught the attention of Soviet intelligence. Agents working in Britain's communist networks sought out sympathetic scientists, and Fuchs's background made him a prime candidate. Through intermediaries, he began sharing small pieces of non-classified research, ostensibly for the global cause of science. But soon, these exchanges took on a different tone. Secret meetings, coded notes, and promises of a world balanced by mutual power. As 1942 dawned, Tube Alloys merged increasingly with American efforts, paving the way for what would become the Forals Manhattan Project. Or the British government, realizing it lacked the resources to build the bomb alone, agreed to share its findings with the United States. In doing so, it also, unknowingly, gave Fuchs a passport into the most secret scientific collaboration in history. In the final months of 1941, while Churchill and Roosevelt drafted the Atlantic Charter, a quiet transfer of documents occurred between London and Washington. Papers bearing equations, diffusion constants, and neutron cross-sections. Among them, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, were the mathematical fingerprints of Klaus Fuchs. They would soon find their way across the Atlantic, and with them, so would he. The refugee from Germany, now a citizen of Britain, would soon stand at the heart of America's most secret military project. The world believed he was building the bomb to end tyranny, but in the shadows, another truth was beginning to form, one that would haunt the atomic age forever. By 1943, the world's fate was being decided not just on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, but in secret laboratories scattered across continents. From Cambridge to Los Alamos, from Oxford to the deserts of New Mexico, the brightest minds on Earth were racing to split the atom before Hitler could. Among them was a quiet man with a soft German accent, Klaus Fuchs, a physicist whose loyalty appeared unshakable, and whose calculations were helping to birth the most devastating weapon ever conceived. When Britain and the United States formally merged their atomic research under the Manhattan Project, Fuchs was one of the select few British scientists sent across the Atlantic. His clearance was approved at the highest level, vouched for by his mentors, Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch. Officially, his assignment was to assist the theoretical division at Los Alamos, led by the brilliant physicist Hans Bethe. Unofficially, he was entering a fortress of secrecy unlike anything the world had ever seen. Los Alamos, perched high in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, was more than a laboratory. It was a sealed city. Censorship was absolute, letters home were screened, and all personnel were under constant watch by Army intelligence. Scientists and soldiers lived side by side behind barbed wire, their badges determining which buildings and conversations they were permitted to enter. Even among geniuses like Oppenheimer, Fermi and Teller, talk was measured, coded, cautious. Fuchs, reserved and methodical, fit easily into this atmosphere. His colleagues admired his tireless work ethic, his mathematical precision, and his ability to translate complex theory into practical engineering solutions. He worked on the crucial problem of neutron diffusion, how neutrons multiply and interact in the heart of a fission reaction, a key step toward making a chain reaction explosive rather than merely sustained. But what no one knew was that, in the quiet hours after his shifts, Fuchs was taking mental photographs of every schematic, every equation, every confidential discussion. In his sparse dormitory room, he memorized details and later reconstructed them by hand: atomic weights, reaction rates, lens geometries, and assembly timing. These were not notes for scientific reflection. They were intelligence reports meant for the Soviet Union. Through a network managed by Soviet handler Harry Gold and coordinated by the NKVD, precursor to the KGB, Fuchs began transmitting data that would eventually prove priceless to Moscow's nuclear ambitions. The Soviets were officially allies, but in the world of intelligence, alliances were temporary and secrets were eternal. Fuchs justified his actions through ideology. He believed that if both East and West possessed the bomb, no single nation could use it as an instrument of dominance. There should be balance, he would later tell interrogators. No nation should be able to destroy the others. As the project intensified, the line between science and moral burden grew thinner. In July 1945, the Trinity test proved the theories correct. Fuchs watched from a distance as the desert turned to daylight. The atomic bomb was no longer theory, it was reality. Yet even then, he was already carrying its blueprints in his mind, destined for another master. Within weeks, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reduced to ash, and the war that had defined an era came to a sudden, violent end. But peace brought no rest. The Manhattan Project dissolved into new bureaucracies. The US Atomic Energy Commission and Britain's reconstituted nuclear program. In these transitions, files were copied, teams were reassigned, and within that administrative fog, Fuchs' trail went unnoticed. He returned to the United Kingdom, hailed as a vital contributor to the greatest scientific achievement in history. No one suspected that the same man had already ensured that the world's monopoly on atomic power would be short-lived. Years Later, one of his colleagues recalled a peculiar moment at Los Alamos. A rumor had spread about Soviet infiltration, prompting security briefings. Fuchs listened quietly, then simply said, "No one person could ever keep this secret forever." At the time, it was dismissed as philosophical musing. In hindsight, it was almost a confession. For Fuchs, espionage had become a routine, an extension of his scientific discipline, data gathered, cross-checked, and delivered with precision. He was not a man who sought wealth or glory. He saw himself as a participant in the shaping of a new world order. His betrayal was not emotional, but analytical, a calculation made in silence. By 1946, the US began to realize how quickly the Soviet Union was advancing its own atomic program. American analysts were baffled. How could the Soviets be closing the gap so fast when they had started from nothing? Few knew that the answer had been sitting in plain sight, sipping tea in the Los Alamos cafeteria, discussing neutron flux with calm detachment. Fuchs's journey from a refugee scientist to a double agent was complete. His reports had already crossed oceans, coded through couriers and invisible ink, landing on the desks of Soviet physicists like Igor Kurchatov, the father of the Soviet bomb. While Oppenheimer grappled with the moral weight of his creation, Fuchs had already set in motion a new kind of war, one that would not end with peace treaties or surrenders. As he boarded a ship back to England, the desert sun fading behind him, Fuchs looked out over the water. The world believed it had entered an age of victory and progress. But beneath the surface, a quieter struggle had already begun. One fought not with armies, but with secrets. And Klaus Fuchs was its invisible architect. In the summer of 1945, the war was finally over. The atomic bomb had fallen, empires had crumbled, and a stunned world began to measure the cost of victory. In laboratories across Britain and America, scientists who had spent years building the bomb now wondered what they had unleashed. Among them, Klaus Fuchs returned to the United Kingdom a celebrated expert, a man trusted with the future of nuclear energy. But beneath the calm surface of reconstruction, a new kind of conflict was beginning to take shape. One fought not for land, but for secrets. Britain, though battered and broke, refused to be left behind in the atomic age. In 1946, it founded the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, AERE, at Harwell, Oxfordshire, the heart of its independent nuclear program. The facility, set among rolling countryside and barbed wire, was designed to develop both civilian and military applications of atomic science. Fuchs, now a British citizen, was appointed head of theoretical physics. He held one of the highest security clearances in the Western world. At Harwell, his new responsibilities were vast. He coordinated research on nuclear reactors, isotope separation, and the early foundations of hydrogen fusion. His reputation as a meticulous thinker and loyal colleague earned him near-total trust from senior officials, including Sir John Cockcroft, the establishment's director. To most, Fuchs appeared the very model of a scientific civil servant, punctual, disciplined, and quietly patriotic. But his allegiance was still divided. Within months of his return, Soviet handlers re-established contact. The Cold War had begun to take shape, and Moscow was desperate to understand just how far behind they were. In smoky safe houses across London, couriers from the KGB's London Residentura met with their most valuable British asset. Using code names like Rest and Charles, Fuchs passed detailed accounts of British and American post-war research, including reactor blueprints, weapon assembly methods, and estimates of Western nuclear stockpiles. Every document he shared closed the gap between East and West. By the late 1940s, Soviet scientists led by Igor Kurchatov and guided by physicist Yakov Zeldovich were reproducing key aspects of the Manhattan Project's designs with uncanny precision. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, always suspicious yet hungry for dominance, personally monitored their progress. The Kremlin's scientists seemed to leap years ahead of schedule, and Western analysts couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, the nuclear partnership that had defined wartime cooperation began to fracture. The United States passed the Matt-McMahon Act of 1946, cutting off Britain from further atomic collaboration. This decision infuriated British leaders who felt abandoned after years of shared sacrifice. To rebuild its independence, The UK accelerated its own bomb program, ironically relying on the same man who was feeding their designs to the Soviets. Fuchs worked in quiet intensity, his double life sustained by routine. During the day, he attended technical briefings and ran calculations on reactor shielding. At night, he encoded messages for Soviet intelligence. His courier, a Polish-born agent named Alexander Feklisov, later described Fuchs as the ideal source, logical, disciplined, almost emotionless. To Fuchs, espionage was an extension of his moral conviction that nuclear knowledge should not be monopolized by one bloc or another. It would be an evil thing, he wrote later, for one nation to hold power of such magnitude while others lived in fear. Still, cracks began to form in his composure. Britain in the late 1940s was a place of austerity and suspicion. Rationing lingered, and the spectre of communism haunted political discourse. The Cambridge five-month spy ring, Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, and Cairncross had begun to attract quiet attention within MI5. Fuchs, though outwardly unconnected, felt the tightening scrutiny. He changed his habits, avoided long meetings, and sometimes refused to speak of politics altogether. Yet his transmissions continued, even as tensions between East and West reached a fever pitch. In 1948, the Berlin blockade turned the Cold War from a diplomatic chill into a confrontation. The West formed NATO, NACAS, and Stalin responded with his iron grip over Eastern Europe. The arms race was underway, and at its center, unseen, unnoticed, was Klaus Fuchs, the man who had given Moscow the key to atomic parity. Then, in August 1949, a seismic event shook the geopolitical landscape. The Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb at Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. Western intelligence was stunned. Analysts at the Atomic Energy Commission estimated that the Soviets wouldn't achieve this feat until 1953. Something, or someone, had accelerated their progress by years. The shock was immediate. President Truman announced the Soviet test publicly, breaking decades of precedent for nuclear secrecy. "We have evidence," he declared, "that within recent weeks, an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR." Inside MI5, the announcement sparked panic. How could the Soviets have achieved such a technical leap without insider knowledge? Within hours, new files were opened, old personnel records reviewed, and forgotten reports re-examined. Still, no one knew where to look. Fuchs continued his work at Harwell with calm precision, reading reports about the Soviet test as if he were a detached observer. When colleagues asked his opinion, he offered only a faint smile. "It was inevitable," he said quietly. "Science does not recognize borders." But the walls were beginning to close in. Across the Atlantic, American counterintelligence had intercepted fragments of decrypted Soviet communications, codenamed Venona. Within them lay cryptic references to an informant inside the Manhattan Project, a physicist of German birth working in Britain. The name was not yet clear, but the hunt had begun. And somewhere deep within the silence of Harwell's laboratories, Klaus Fuchs must have felt it. The faint vibration of suspicion, the slow tightening of the net. His greatest secret had already changed the balance of power, but his own time in the shadows was running out. In the late summer of 1949, the Western world was jolted by an announcement that shattered its sense of atomic security. On August 29th, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The weapon, codenamed First Lightning, was an almost exact replica of the American plutonium implosion device dropped on Nagasaki. Intelligence analysts in Washington and London were stunned. Every estimate, every calculation, had predicted that Moscow was at least 5 years away from nuclear capability. Something, or someone, had changed the equation. As President Harry S. Truman publicly confirmed the Soviet test on September 23, 1949, panic rippled through Western intelligence. MI5, the CIA, and the newly formed US Atomic Energy Commission began a top-down review of every scientist who had ever held access to atomic secrets. Laboratories, research institutes, and embassy communications were placed under quiet surveillance. Somewhere, deep in the network of wartime collaboration, a traitor had slipped through. In the quiet offices of Britain's MI5, the search began under the direction of Roger Hollis and William Scarden. Men who understood that espionage in science left faint but traceable fingerprints. They had a clue: tiny, cryptic fragments of Soviet intelligence traffic decrypted by an ultra-secret project called WWII. These intercepted messages, encoded during the war and painstakingly decoded over years, contained references to a Soviet source within the Manhattan Project known only by a codename: REST. The WWII decrypts were incomplete and inconsistent, but patterns emerged. The mysterious REST had a German background, held a PhD in physics, worked in both Britain and the United States during the war, and maintained close ties to the British scientific establishment afterward. That narrowed the list dramatically. Among the few men fitting the profile, one name stood out to investigators: Klaus Fuchs. At first, suspicion seemed almost absurd. Fuchs had been one of Britain's most reliable scientific minds, a refugee from Nazi Germany, a man who had fled totalitarianism and devoted his talents to defeating it. But the decrypts did not lie. MI5 began to quietly re-examine Fuchs's file. His communist affiliations in the 1930s, long dismissed as youthful idealism, now seemed more significant. Interviews with colleagues revealed that while Fuchs was diligent and courteous, he remained emotionally distant, even secretive. "A good man," one co-worker said, "but one you never truly knew." Surveillance teams moved in discreetly. His mail was intercepted, his phone monitored, and his movements tracked. Fuchs, however, gave them nothing: no clandestine meetings, no suspicious behavior. He was calm, punctual, and unflinchingly methodical. To the outside world, he remained the perfect civil servant. But within MI5, pressure was building. They needed proof, not speculation. That proof came through an unexpected channel. Harry Gold, a Philadelphia-based courier for the Soviet NKVD, had been arrested by the FBI in the United States. Under interrogation, Gold admitted to meeting a British scientist in 1945 who had supplied him with information from Los Alamos. He described the man precisely: his accent, his demeanor, his careful handwriting. When the FBI compared Gold's description with MI5's suspicions, the pieces fell into place. The man he had met was Klaus Fuchs. In late 1949, MI5 decided to act. William Scarden, known for his calm and conversational interrogation style, was assigned to the case. Rather than confront Fuchs abruptly, Scarden arranged a series of seemingly routine security interviews at Harwell. They began in December, casual in tone. Fuchs appeared relaxed, answering each question with clinical detachment. But the questioning grew tighter. By January 1950, Scarden presented subtle inconsistencies drawn from WWII data and Gold's testimony. Fuchs listened quietly, then, without hesitation, said, "I will tell you everything." Over several days of confession, Fuchs unraveled the full scope of his espionage. He described how, beginning in 1941, he had passed scientific details to Soviet contacts in London, and later, from Los Alamos through Harry Gold. He named meetings, described courier exchanges, and even sketched diagrams of what he had transmitted. His memory was flawless. "I did not do it for profit," he told investigators. "I wanted the Russians to know what the Americans were doing. I thought perhaps it would help to keep the peace." The magnitude of his betrayal was staggering. Fuchs had provided the Soviets with comprehensive data on the plutonium implosion design, diffusion constants, and bomb assembly timing, information that had shaved years off their development timeline. MI5 agents, hardened by years of counterintelligence work, sat stunned as Fuchs spoke in calm, deliberate tones, explaining the details of an operation that had changed the global balance of power. By the end of his confession, MI5 had more than enough evidence for prosecution. Yet the revelation caused deep unease in London and Washington alike. If Fuchs, the model scientist and refugee hero, could be a Soviet agent, how many others had escaped detection? His case exposed vulnerabilities at the very core of the Anglo-American alliance. Secret memos between MI5 and the FBI began circulating with urgent warnings about other possible penetrations within nuclear and diplomatic ranks. When Fuchs was formally arrested on February 2, 1950, the story hit the world press like a thunderclap. "Atom Spy Confesses" blared the front pages of the Times and the New York Herald Tribune. In Moscow, the news was quietly celebrated. In Washington, it was met with anger and fear. The timing was catastrophic. The Korean War was months away, and Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was about to begin. Fuchs' confession ignited the paranoia that would define an entire era. As he sat in his cell awaiting trial, Klaus Fuchs remained eerily composed. He expressed regret, not for his actions, but for the pain they caused his friends and colleagues. To him, espionage had been an act of conscience, not betrayal. "I had to do what I believed was right," he told his sister, Elsa, in a letter before sentencing. Outside, MI5 was already turning its gaze toward a larger mystery. Who had Fuchs connected with, and who had remained hidden in the network he helped build? The hunt was far from over. His confession had opened one door, but behind it, many shadows still moved. In the winter of 1950, Britain awoke to a scandal unlike any in its modern history. The quiet physicist from Harwell, the refugee who had fled Hitler, served Britain faithfully, and helped unlock the power of the atom, had confessed to betraying his country. Klaus Fuchs's espionage wasn't just an act of treachery. It was a revelation that Britain's most secure scientific fortress had been compromised from within. The headlines screamed, "Atom spy gave secrets to Russia," and the nation held its breath, grappling with the idea that the man they had trusted to safeguard the bomb had, instead, shared it. Behind the sensational headlines, however, the reality was more complex and far more disturbing. When MI5's interrogator, William Scarden, had first sat across from Fuchs in that small office at Harwell, he hadn't expected a confession so complete. Fuchs spoke with the precision of a scientist presenting a paper. He described his years of espionage as though reciting a technical report. Dates, locations, code names, and procedures all meticulously remembered. It was not bravado, nor an attempt to justify. It was simply truth, stripped of emotion. He detailed his first contact with Soviet intelligence in Britain in 1941 through a man named Jürgen Kuczynski, a fellow communist and economist who introduced him to his Soviet controller, Ursula Kuczynski, codenamed Sonia. Sonia was one of Moscow's most experienced agents, a German-born courier operating under deep cover in the English countryside near Oxford. To the outside world, she was a friendly mother of three who rode her bicycle through rural villages. To the Soviets, she was a vital link to their most valuable atomic source. Through Sonia, Fuchs passed early details of Britain's tube alloys program, long before America entered the war. Later, while stationed at Los Alamos, he met with courier Harry Gold. A meeting arranged with mathematical precision to avoid detection. Fuchs would walk several miles from his quarters to meet Gold in Albuquerque, always at night, always alone. They would exchange data written on small slips of paper, specifications of plutonium implosion designs, timing mechanisms, and reactor data, wrapped in innocuous packaging. Fuchs's recollections of these encounters were chillingly exact. His motivation, he explained, was not loyalty to the Soviet Union, but fear of imbalance. "I did not see the Russians as the enemy," he told Scarden. "I thought if they too had the knowledge, no one would dare use the bomb." In his mind, atomic parity was the only guarantee against annihilation. To him, secrecy was the true danger, not disclosure. As the investigation widened, MI5's analysts pored over years of communication logs, travel records, and decoded Venona messages. The threads led to a broader web, to the American couriers, to the Rosenbergs, and to other suspected sources still hidden within Western research establishments. The arrest of Fuchs set off a domino effect. In the United States, Harry Gold was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His testimony led to the exposure of David Greenglass, who in turn implicated Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The fallout from one man's confession rippled across continents. When the case went to trial at the Old Bailey in London on March 1, 1950, the outcome was inevitable. There was no jury. Fuchs had already confessed. He pleaded guilty to violating the Official Secrets Act, his voice calm and steady as the charges were read. The prosecution detailed the scale of the espionage, explaining that his information had given the Soviet Union an atomic weapon years before they could have achieved it otherwise. The presiding judge, Van Peer, Lord Goddard, called Fuchs's betrayal one of the gravest crimes imaginable. The sentence, 14 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the law for peacetime espionage. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Reporters noted that Fuchs did not flinch. He simply nodded once, then turned and walked out with the same deliberate composure that had marked every act of his life. Outside, the press surged against police barricades, desperate for a glimpse of the man who had helped start the Cold War. At Wandsworth Prison, and later at Wakefield, Fuchs remained the model inmate. He read voraciously, continued to work on mathematical problems, and corresponded with his sister, Elsa, who never abandoned him. In interviews, guards described him as polite but distant, a man completely at peace with what he had done. He never seemed broken, one recalled, almost as if he believed history would vindicate him. Meanwhile, the Western security apparatus underwent a reckoning. Every clearance, every scientist, every foreign-born expert was reviewed. The United States tightened its secrecy laws and accelerated its development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than anything conceived at Los Alamos. The British, stung by humiliation, doubled down on their independent bomb project, culminating in our Operation Hurricane. In 1952, their first successful nuclear test. Ironically, the very betrayal that had endangered Anglo-American cooperation also drove both nations to greater nuclear capability. Yet the moral questions lingered. Could Fuchs' reasoning that balance prevented catastrophe hold any truth? Did his actions, however misguided, actually deter the atomic monopoly that might have driven one superpower toward dominance and war? These questions divided historians and ethicists alike. In 1959, after serving just 9 years of his sentence, Klaus Fuchs was quietly released for good behavior. Britain had changed. Rationing was gone, the empire was fading, and the Cold War had become an accepted reality. Fuchs, stripped of his citizenship, boarded a plane to East Germany, where he was greeted not as a traitor, but as a hero of socialist science. There, in the shadow of a divided Europe, he resumed his work on nuclear physics, rising to become deputy director of the Central Institute for Nuclear Research. But even as he built reactors for a different flag, his name continued to echo in the West, a reminder that in the world of secrets, loyalty was never simple and truth was never absolute. Fuchs had set out to prevent domination by one power, yet in doing so, he had divided the world forever, and though his confession had ended the mystery of who betrayed the bomb, it opened a larger, darker question. What other secrets had slipped silently across the Iron Curtain, still waiting to be discovered? When Klaus Fuchs stepped out of Wakefield Prison in June 1959, he was a free man, at least by the letter of the law. He carried no fanfare, no possessions beyond a suitcase and a folded suit. Britain, the country he had served and betrayed, quietly arranged his departure. He boarded an eastbound flight under watchful eyes, bound for the new world he had helped create. The divided continent of the Cold War. Waiting for him in East Berlin was the government of the German Democratic Republic, eager to welcome one of its most infamous sons home. For the communist leadership of East Germany, Fuchs was not a criminal, but a hero, a man who had restored balance in the atomic age. Upon his arrival, he was met not by interrogators, but by dignitaries and reporters. He smiled awkwardly for the cameras, the same modest, soft-spoken scientist who had always preferred laboratories to limelight. Within months, he was appointed deputy director of the Central Institute for Nuclear Research at Rossendorf, near Dresden. His expertise helped shape East Germany's fledgling nuclear program, ostensibly civilian, but always shadowed by military ambition. Life in the East was ordered, cautious, and watched. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, kept Fuchs under quiet surveillance, more out of reverence than suspicion. His office overlooked the complex's reactor building, where Soviet and East German scientists worked on isotope separation and particle physics. He lectured on theoretical physics, mentored students, and occasionally gave speeches about scientific cooperation for peace. To his colleagues, he was precise, disciplined, and reserved, a man who lived as though still answering to an invisible code. Yet beneath the calm surface, the world Fuchs had helped shape was spiraling toward perpetual tension. The nuclear balance he once saw as peace through equality had become a race for annihilation. By the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were testing hydrogen bombs with yields thousands of times greater than those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought humanity within a breath of nuclear war. The equilibrium Fuchs had envisioned now teetered on the brink of destruction. In the West, his name became a symbol of betrayal, whispered in the same breath as Burgess, McLean, and Philby. American intelligence analysts still referred to him in classified briefings as Agent Rest. Historians debated his motives endlessly. Was he a spy, an idealist, or simply a man caught in the moral contradictions of his time? His own explanations remained frustratingly consistent. "I had no wish to harm anyone," he once said in an East German interview. "I wished to prevent one side from destroying the other." Privately, some of his peers, even those who despised his actions, admitted that his reasoning contained a grim logic. The monopoly of the atom, they feared, could have tempted one power into unchecked aggression, and yet, the alternative Fuchs had created was a world perpetually armed, perpetually afraid. His legacy was not peace, but parity, a balance maintained by fear rather than understanding. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Fuchs continued his work, publishing papers on neutron scattering and reactor safety. He received awards from the East German Academy of Sciences and was celebrated in state newspapers as a scientist of international conscience. But within his quiet home near Dresden, those who knew him spoke of a man haunted by silence. His colleagues recalled long pauses between conversations, moments when his gaze drifted beyond the horizon, as if he were measuring the weight of all that had followed from his choices. In the West, new revelations from Soviet archives would eventually confirm the scale of his espionage. The declassified Venona files proved that his data had directly advanced the Soviet bomb program by several years. Former Soviet scientists, in interviews after the Cold War, would describe Fuchs's reports as gold, invaluable in verifying theoretical models and confirming implosion mechanisms. Without Fuchs, they admitted, the 1949 detonation might have been delayed, perhaps long enough for the US nuclear monopoly to dominate global politics. Fuchs lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the ideological divide that had defined his life's choices. By then, he was 78, retired, and quietly fading from public memory. The nation that had once celebrated him now looked toward reunification, and his presence became an embarrassment to those eager to forget the darker legacies of the Cold War. He gave no interviews, offered no reflections. When asked by a journalist if he regretted his past, he simply replied, "What is done cannot be undone." Klaus Fuchs died in 1988, just a year before the wall came down, in a small hospital outside Dresden. There was no state funeral, no Western obituary of grandeur, only a short notice in a local paper. Professor Dr. Klaus Fuchs, physicist, passed away quietly at age 76. He was buried beneath a modest stone, engraved only with his name, his profession, and the words, diente der Wissenschaft. He served science. In the decades since, his story has become a mirror for the age he helped define, an age where knowledge was both power and peril. Fuchs remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a man of conviction who believed his betrayal was an act of balance, and whose actions ensured that humanity would live under the shadow of the bomb for generations. Even now, historians still debate whether Klaus Fuchs was a traitor, a visionary, or a tragic idealist. But one truth endures. Without firing a shot, without raising a weapon, he altered the course of the 20th century. The quiet man from Germany became the invisible hand behind the atomic standoff, the spy who stole the bomb and gave it to the world.